Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, 3 lines from the top. Our Mishnah is discussing shechting a korban Pesach on Yudah that comes out to be on Shabbos. The beginning of the Mishnah talks about a case where a person takes the korban Pesach and he shechts it shaloi lishmo. For example, l'shem a korban shlomim. He's chayiv a korban chatos because the korban is posel. Towards the end of the Mishnah discusses a case where a person shechts the korban Pesach shaloi lemenuyov. For example, an entire chabura of people who cannot eat the korban Pesach, either because they're cholim, they're sick, or the zikanim, they're elderly. And the Mishnah also then says that he's going to be chayiv a korban chatos for shechting shet korban on Yudah that comes out to be on Shabbos. Ask the Gemara right away. Pshita, that's straightforward. Kevon dehasam posul hacha chayiv. Since at the previous parak we had a Mishnah expressed explicitly in the Mishnah that one who shechs the korban Pesach who shechs the korban Pesach for an entire chabura are not those who are able to eat a korban Pesach. It's a korban Pesach that is posul. So then certainly when he then shechs that korban Pesach on Shabbos, he'll be chayiv a korban chatos. Answers the Gemara Mishum the Tana Seifa Potter Tana Reisha Chayiv. Because the Tana teaches in the next case, in the Seifa, where he shechs the korban Pesach on Yudal that comes down on Shabbos, Bein be'oichlov, bein shaloi la'oichlov, both for those who can eat the korban Pesach as well as those who cannot eat the korban Pesach, then he is potter. Ask the Gemara, v'honami pshita, but that case also is poshut, because mishum dahasam kosher hacha potter. In the previous parak again, on Daf Samach Aleph Amid Aleph, the same Mishnah states that when he shechs the korban Pesach for a chabur that has part of that chabur is those who can partake in the eating of the korban Pesach, they can eat a kazayas, as well as those who are loy la'ochlov, then it's going to be kosher, whereby if you were to shech such a korban on Shabbos, when Yudah comes out to be on Shabbos, then he's going to be potter. So that's also straightforward. Why does our Mishnah have to teach that case? Ella says the Gemara, Aidi de Tana shochtoi shaloi lishmoi b'Shabbos, Tana nami shaloi la'oichlov. Once the Tana teaches the first case in our Mishnah, that he shechs the korban Pesach shaloi lishmoi, dahainu, for example, a korban shlomim, whereby he's going to be chayiv a korban chatos. So then, agav that, it taught our case of oichlov and oichlov shaloi la'oichlov. In other words, the fact that the previous parak discussed a case where a person shechs a korban Pesach shaloi lishma, and then also then discusses in the Mishnayos that he shechs a korban Pesach shaloi la'oichlov, or shaloi la'oichlov, then it also then parallels that in our Mishnah as well, and teaches that also here. But the Gemara still is bothered. Vahi gufa lamali. Even the very first case in our Mishnah, though, that states when he shechs the korban Pesach shaloi lishmoi, he's chayiv a korban chatos. That itself, why do we need to teach that? We already know from the first parak before that such a korban is posel. So when he shechs it on Shabbos, certainly then it will be chayiv a korban chatos. Answers the Gemara Mishum the Kiboy li'ifluge Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua. Because there's a machlokes in the next case of our Mishnah, where a person shechs a korban for the shame of a shlomim, he thinks that is a korban shlomim when it's really a korban Pesach. There's a machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Here it's a case we're talking about where he is shtoye bidvar mitzvah, ve'asa mitzvah. Here Rabbi Eliezer says he's still chayiv a korban chatos. And Rabbi Yoshua argued and said he is potter. So in order then to teach this case, where Rabbi Eliezer then brings a proof to support himself from the first case of the Mishnah, where a person who shechs the korban Pesach, there he can be doiche Shabbos, but he changes his designation to be a korban shlomim, then it's possible. Then kal v'chomer, says Rabbi Eliezer, that when a person has a korban shlomim, because he thinks there's a korban shlomim, it's really a korban Pesach, a korban shlamim that is not doiches Shabbos, certainly then, when he then changes its designation to be korban Pesach, it will also not be doiches Shabbos and be chayiv a korban chatos. So in order then to bring that, we also then brought the subsequent cases as well. Says the Gemara, Omar le Rav Yehuna bar Chinana lebrei. Rav Huna bar China said to his son, Ki azlis lekamei the Rabbi Zrika boimine. When you come before Rabbi Zrika, ask him the following questions. Ledivrei ha'oimim mekalkil bechabura potter. Now, there's a machlokes in Masechet Shabbos. We know when it comes to malachos on Shabbos, they are creative acts, whereby a person who does a creative act, one of the malachos of Shabbos, he's going to be chayiv if he does a b'shogeg, a korban chatos. Now, one of those malachos, for example, is shoichet. One who is shoichet on Shabbos, so he's going to be chayiv a korban chatos. Now, shchita, for the purpose of shchita, so you can eat the animal's meat, that certainly is going to be a constructive purpose. But let's say a tolda of shchita, which is chabura, causing a wound, that is the destructive act. Unless he's using the wound, he's causing blood to be let, so that he can then feed it to a dog. It's a destructive, it's a kilkul. So there's a machlokes in Masechet Shabbos that when you're mekalkil, is that going to be chayiv or not? So what are the man numbers of mekalkil bechabura is potter? Asks the Gemara, shachtoi sheloi la'oichlav chayiv. In our Mishnah says the case is when he shechs a korban for the people who cannot eat a kazayis of the meat, an entire chabura, he's going to be chayiv. Ask the Gemara, my tiken, how can he be chayiv? According to this man, the Omar, who says that one who is mekalke bechabura is potter, here, how can he be chayiv? He did a kilkul by shechtei korban Pesach, shaloi la'oichlav. Here comes out that it's a invalid korban, whereby it's a kilkul. Answers the Gemara, Tikain im olu lo yardu. The takana is that if, however, the korban was put on the mizbeach, then we don't bring it down, and therefore that itself is a tikkun whereby he's going to be chayiv chatos. Ask the Gemara for the next case of our Mishnah. Shach doi v'nimtzo bal mum chayiv. If he shechs the korban, then he finds out that it was a bal mum. He's going to be chayiv because he should have checked to determine that it does not have a mum beforehand. So therefore he's held responsible. Frek the Gemara matikein. But again, according to this man the Omar, hamakalka b'chabura is potter. Why is he going to be chayiv over here? What's the tikkun? Answers the Gemara, tikein bedukin sheba'ayin. V'aliv Rabbi Akiva the Omar im olu lo yerdu. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that such a mum bedukin sheba'ayin, this is something that if it was done, if it was a mum by a bird, it will not poisel the bird. And since over here we're talking about where it had this mum before, only after it was consecrated, therefore Rabbi Akiva says if it's oilu, if it goes up on the mizbech, then lo yirdu. So therefore that's also a tikkun. Ask him on the next case of the Mishnah. Shachtu v'nimtza treifa b'seisir potter. If he checks the animal, the korban on Shabbos, the korban pesach on Shabbos, and then he determines that it had a treifa, that in a place that was undetectable, for example in the lung, so then he's potter. The Gemara now makes a diuk on that case. Ha begalui chayiv. But if indeed it was a treifa that was in a place that was galui, where he could have then determined it beforehand, then he's going to be chayiv. Ask the Gemara again, according to Man the Omer says, Mekalka b'chabur is potter, my tikein. What did he do to then make it a constructive act? Answers the Gemara, tikein lahoitzi midei nevela. The fact that he then shechted it prevented it from becoming a nevela. A nevela is metame, and when it's something that's shechted, it's not metame. So therefore, that itself is a tikkun. The Gemara now asks on all of this, Maskif l'Ravino, Hai detanya hashoichet chatos b'Shabbos b'chutz la'avodah zara. One who shechs a korban chatos on Shabbos outside of the Azara, and for avodah zara, so then he's going to be chayiv aleh chimo chatos. 3 times he's going to be chayiv a korban chatos. My tiken, how is he going to be chayiv a korban chatas? Now we cannot use the previous answer because here, when a person shechs for avodah zara, then it's still metameh. So therefore, what is the tikkun according to Manda Omer, who says mekalke bechabura is potter? Answers the Gemara Amar Rabbi Avira shemoitzio midei aver min hachai. Before the animal was shechted, if he would eat from the animal aver min hachai, if it was a goy b'chayiv misa, and if it's a yid, he's over an iser deraisa. And here we're talking about that he now took it out of that status of aver min hachai. So that's also considered to be a tikkun. The latter part of our Mishnah discusses the following case. A person shechs the korban pesach, and he shechs it for a certain chabura of individuals. Subsequent to the shechita of the korban pesach, he then is told, he finds out that chabura either took away their inclusion from that chabura. In other words, there was no chabura that existed at the time of the shechita, or that chabura entirely they all died, or they all became tamei. So technically, the korban therefore is possible because the shas shechita didn't have a chabura, didn't have bailim. However, the one who shechted it was not aware of it, and there was no reason for him to know of this before he shechted it, and therefore it's considered to be an oines, and he's potter. The Gemara now uses this case ultimately to ask a question on the following case. And that's the connection over here. Omer Rav Huna Omer Rav. Rav Huna says in the name of Rav the following case. Osham shenitek l'ri'iyah. Now you have a case where a person was chayiv to bring a korban osham. And either he died, or that korban osham that he designated to be a korban osham was lost. He then subsequently was makdish another behema as a korban osham, and he brought up that korban that animal as a korban osham. Subsequently, he found the original lost korban osham. So the protocol is as follows: you're supposed to then take that osham and shenitek l'ri'iyah, then put it out. Literally, nitek means it should be then separated, detached, for being to graze out by the grass until it gets a mum. When it develops a mum, then you are to then take the animal and then sell it, take the proceeds to buy a korban oila for the tzibur. That is the protocol. However, Rav Huna said in Rav, in such a case where they let the animal go ahead and graze, but before it came a mum, somebody came, let's say the bailim or somebody else came and shechted that animal. V'shachdoi stam. The din is kosher la'oila. Rav says it's kosher as a korban oila for the tzibur. Alma, the Gemara says from here, kisover loibo akira. We see from Rav that he does not require akira, because since it was a korban osham and he merely shechted it stam, so that's enough to make it a kosher oila, says Rav. So he did not have to then make an akira by changing the status, by making a korban, by shechting it l'shem a korban oila. The very fact they just shechted it stam automatically was enough. Ihachi asked the Gemara, ki loy nitak nami. When he did not then put the animal to graze, so then why don't we say the same thing? Let him shecht it stam, and according to Rav, since anyways it doesn't need to have a designation in akira, the fact that he shechted stam should be kosher. Why do we have to bring a case, Rav, that he's oshim shenitak l'ri'iyah? Why don't we just say that he takes that animal and he shechts it? Answers the Gemara, Gezeira la'achar kapara otu lifnei kapara. The Gemara says, as a gezeira, because if he would take the animal, the osham now, after he had brought the previous osham and fulfilled his obligation, he now takes this new osham and he would shecht it. People would think that you can go ahead and use the osham as a korban oila even before the kapara. And therefore, a regular osham can be used as an oila. And then if he's convenient for him, he'll take it, use it as an oila, and then get another osham. Therefore, it has to be that he first gives it out to graze, whereby it's understood that it's not going to be the same osham that he used for the need to bring a korban. and then he can go ahead and after it grazes, according to Rav at least, even though he's not supposed to do this, the protocol is to let it get a mum, but if he did take it, then it's a kosher animal if he shechs it even stam. Asking from where do we know such a thing that there's a gezerah of achar kapara atu lifnei kapara? This nan states in the following Mishnah. Osham shemeisu bailov oishenis kapu bailov. The case that we're talking about, where there's a carbon osham whose owners died, the owner died, or they already got a kapara because the osham got lost. The bailim got a new osham, then offered that as a carbon, then found the old osham. So the protocol again is yira ash yistoiv v'yimacha v'yiplu domav l'nidava. The Tanna Kama says let it go ahead and graze until it gets a mum, then it should be sold, and use the money for a carbon nidava, which is for be a carbon oila as a communal oila. Rabbi Eliezer Oimer, excuse me, Yamus. Rabbi Eliezer says Yamus. He says that the same din that would be for carbon chatos is equally applicable to a carbon osham, whereby you would have to leave it to die. Rabbi Yoshua Oimer Yemacher v'yavi b'damav oila. Rabbi Yoshua argues, and he says that it should be sold, and it should be brought and used when you then sell it, take the money, and then go ahead and buy a carbon oila, and then use it for your personal carbon oila. Now, take a look at Rashi and Dibra Maschil, the Yaviv Bedam of oila. Rashi explains, what is the difference in the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua and the Tanna Kama? They both said that you should go ahead and sell the animal and take the proceeds to buy an oila. Says Rashi, in Dima Masav Yavi B'Dava Oila, Nidava La'atzmo, it'll be a carbon Nidava for himself, a personal, an individual carbon. Unlike the Tanna Kama is talking about a Oila of a Tzibur. U'meseches Tmur Masik L'Lam Hilsa, V'haloi Af HaNidava Oilahi, even a Nidava is an Oila. So that begs the question, what's the difference in Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yeshua? Ma bein Divrei Rabbi Yeshua L'Divrei Chachamim, Ela Shebizman Shehi Ba L'Chavasoi, according to Rabbi Yoshua, since it's a personal carbon, therefore the carbon oil he does smicha on it by putting his weight on the animal, and the nesachim that come with it, he's responsible for the cost of those nesachim. Whereas according to Tanna Kama, since it's a carbon sibur, therefore the nesachim are paid by the sibur, and there's no smicha. As Rashi concludes, so Akaponim, the Gemara brings this Mishnah, and now is medayik the words of Rabbi Yoshua that says you sell the osham, with the proceeds you buy a carbon oila for yourself, and then bring it up as a carbon oila. The Gemara is medayik midama v'in aval gufo loy. That's only the dama, when you get and you sell the animal, the proceeds you can use for the carbon oila, but you can't use the osham itself. You can't use the osham itself. Answers, so therefore, so the Gemara says, why not? Taka, why can't you bring the osham itself? Why do you have to then sell it? The answer is because the gazel la'achar kapora oto lifnei kapora, because of a gezerah. The gezerah is that if you would be able to use this osham directly to bring as a carbon oila, people might mistakenly think that you can bring a regular osham for your carbon oila, and since it was already designated as an osham, it cannot be used as an oila. Only over here, since you already fulfilled your obligation of the osham, then this osham can yes be used as an oila. So as not to make that mistake, it says you have to go ahead and let it graze. Then when you let it graze, then people understand it's not your carbon osham anymore. And therefore, it's a gezerah of la'achar kapara atu lifnei kapara, to then make sure that you will not go ahead and use this animal to then directly take the osham and use it as a carbon oila. So a person will not should make a mistake. Shma mina, this is the source of the gezerah that we just said earlier on behalf of Rav, in the case of why it is that he has to use a scenario where the osham has to first graze, and then when Rav talked about he shechs it stam, it's going to be a kosher oila.